Okay, without further ado, please warmly welcome Richard for his talk on Europe's New Dark Age. Take it away, Richard.
Thank you, Brandon. Just to be clear, I can only see my PowerPoint. I can't see any of you or anything else, but Brandon and I have got it to this point, so I'm not going to fiddle with my computer. It's a pleasure to be doing this, not least because I know one or two friends are online. Ian Ridler persuaded me to do it, and he emailed me earlier telling me that he would be online. I'm doing it simply because here I am in Philadelphia and I have a contract to write a book, but I keep putting the book off. And so I've been starting to think about what the book should look like. And in thinking about it, it's made me read much more widely than I have been doing. And as a result, I put together a few ideas, which I'm going to share with you now, around my central view that there was what historians are coming to call the Great Divergence between roughly 600 and 1000, that is between the era in which the Mediterranean economy collapsed and in the period after 1000 when it took shape yet again. And in doing this, I want to look at a few themes and one theme in particular. I wrote Dark Age Economics many years ago as a result of being at Southampton with David Hinton, amongst others, and it is really very much a towns and trade book. It's a book that was an anthropological answer in a way to what Martin Biddle up the road from Southampton was writing at that time, publishing at that time, and it was an attempt to make sense of Hamwick, the town where the Anglo-Saxon town where I have been a research scholar while at Southampton University. I reframed Dark Age Economics about 10 years ago, and I reframed it largely in the shadow of Chris Wickham's Framing the Middle Ages. I worked with Chris for many years in Italy, and we'd argued a great deal over it, but I became persuaded, not least, I became persuaded by his arguments around the accumulation of land, and in particular agricultural management, as a central key aspect of his early medieval post-fiscal economy, as he called it. And in doing that, I tried to reframe Dark Age Economics in a different way, taking account, though, at the same time, of some of the very seductive works by the historian Peter Brown. And that's where I finished in 2012, but I've continued to come back to it because I felt I didn't do justice to it. And that's what I'm, in a sense, that's a few of the ideas I'm playing with this afternoon. So my central thought is that after the Great Divergence, where the North Sea and the Mediterranean separate to all intents and purposes, the roots of feudalism, that is 9th to 10th century, the first feudal era, lie in what Ian Wood, the historian, has called a temple society. But actually, if you look more closely, that temple society, as Ian Wood himself acknowledges, is rooted in the binary circumstances that Peter Brown, in his magnificent Through the Eye of a Needle, claims to be in the 6th century transformation of the Roman world from a world in which the aristocracy have a big part to a world that essentially poses the clergy versus warriors, a world where notions of wealth and the Christian soul, as to quote Peter Brown, slid into place with the collapse, as I said, of the aristocracy, where wealth is now invested in the church and the poor, and wealth had become, in a sense, something for the dead, according to Brown. And that started me thinking, not least in reading Mayake de Jong's work on the role of the political economy in early medieval society and what she calls the ecclesia, essentially a polity across Europe that is defined to a greater or lesser extent by the role the search for salvation. In the search for salvation, however, because it's quite hard as an archaeologist to do that, I started going back to one of my old ideas that I stole from Georges Duby, namely of the Third Order. And I started to examine the role of craftsmen, artisans across Europe, and as you'll see, across the Carolingian world in the context of that. And that led me ultimately to see the changes which I'm now documenting in a project I'm doing through the University of Siena in Tuscany that happens in the middle of the 9th century, and really, in my view, is part and parcel of the material changes that underpin feudalism in a way, of course, that people like Duby or before him, Marc Bloch, had no access to the material culture to look at. And that, lastly, has led me to think very much about the debate between consensus and top-down politics. Dark Age economics originally was much criticized for its view of being very top-down. Consensus, the Max Weber view of trying to find consensus between the peasantry and the aristocracy that Franz Theos in particular has promoted, is actually a very attractive model when you look in terms of the various archaeologies that we have at our disposal. Now, very briefly, the 6th century was still very much a monastic world, very much a materialistic world, not a monastic world. This is, I happen to have dug 2 sites at Butrint that are probably prototypes or early monasteries. These, one is outside Butrint, one is on the shore nearby. They are materially rich on the one hand, but in terms of productivity, they are very, very minimal. And then immediately they're constructed, the world around them collapses. Butrint is quite remarkable because we've dug so much of it from the 6th century. We can see that collapse is happening there in the 2nd and certainly the 3rd quarters of the 6th century. So that invited me to look at the roots of what's happening in Northwest Europe as that collapse occurs in the Mediterranean. And my old friend Bernard Wales here, who I was at Penn with, and I show a picture of him, he was the person who identified ewares in Western Britain, and in particular in Ireland and Southwest Scotland. Those ewares we can now see are being traded in significant numbers through the Irish Sea world in the last phase of the Roman era. They occur at Vigo in western Spain, but they then are found all the way up to Scotland, as Ewan Campbell has shown. And what they coincide with is the construction of these extraordinary monasteries that have come to light in later 6th, 7th, early 8th century Ireland, Southwest Scotland, the classic Celtic monastery like Nendrum with its tidal mill, and Clonfad with its tons, it hasn't got 1.5 tons, but it's got 350 kilos of slag for making handbells. Extraordinary emphasis in these small Christian communities on industrialization. Something that Martin Carver very attractively pointed out for Portmahomack. At the same time, another Celtic period monastery, this time in Scotland, where he laid emphasis upon metal and vellum production as part and parcel of the outreach in the 7th, 8th centuries. That led me on to thinking, largely because I had a chance encounter with Gabor Thomas about Jarrow, Monkwearmouth, Flixborough, Brandon, and of course Lyminge in Kent, where Gabor is excavating. And here he's argued that a site, probably a royal site, was then taken over in the later part of the 7th century and became a productive and agrarian unit as well as a monastic one. In other words, it had a sectorial character to it that was both ecclesiastical on the one hand and productive on the other. That has led to an interesting parallel discussion by Franz Theiss in a marvelous article called Reverse Directions, where he's rethought the shatter economies of the period and argued that instead of shatters being exported from the Low Countries to England, particularly Eastern England, they were in fact exporting wine and receiving silver in return, and that many of the shatters, he claims, were actually, besides being minted in the emporia of the period, were being minted by the minsters of the period. And what you're looking at in John Blair's terms is the proliferation of minsters as they become productive units, much like Lyminge, much like the Irish monasteries in the later 7th and 8th centuries, and engaging, therefore, with cross-channel trade. Quite how that cross-channel trade actually works, I have an early map on the right here, if you can see it, and my map from David Peacock's book from 1977, which tries to show a binary differences between the English Channel on the one hand and the North Sea on the other. And I suspect, as I see the first publications of Ipswich, thankfully coming out now, that binary situation is still not too far off the mark. What is intriguing is in this picture that Franz Theiss has presented us, in this picture in which the minsters are productive, is what actually is the role of the emporia. And I wasn't really going to talk about emporia today, but since Brandon is on the line, I thought at least one should mention them. What's clear from the archaeology is that they are massive investments on the one hand, and in the case of Hamwich, which you can see, not only a gridded town with a major thoroughfare in the center, with this emphasis, as Ian Riddler showed a few weeks ago in this seminar, on, in his case, the production of combs and other bone objects, but also with a very distinct western boundary, a boundary that I still find extremely intriguing and will mention in but a moment. Now, Chris Loveluck and Dries Tys took me apart in a rigorous and most engaging, absorbing article some 15 years ago, in which he claimed that the emporia could no longer be viewed as control points for prestige goods. They thought, the main points at which royal authorities taxed long-distance trade in finished goods and bulk commodities. There's no evidence, they argued, of royal interest in limited access to imported materials. And in addition, the emporia were a part and parcel of many other such sites where the degree of toll collection and control was unknown. And they really did go to town on my typology, from essentially periodic to planned places. And then in a very safe way, they concluded that the more limited datable material suggests changes to reorganization, a regional reorganization in the 10th century. Well, I did try to contest some of this in Dark Age Economics and New Audit 10 years ago, but I think what you're looking at is perhaps control and perhaps tolls in the emporia on regional and interregional trade. Maybe we'll come back to talk about that. But are the emporia and small sites really contemporary? There's still a lot of work to be done on that. And in particular, coming back to that ditch, I do wonder whether the control an absence of control in the smaller sites in the first period, essentially the Shatter period, 680, 750, that is when those minsters were active, was actually the same thing in the period 790 to 820, when I do wonder if places like Hamwich, and I haven't my books here for London and Ipswich to check, whether there was a change in functionality of these places at that time, for reasons I'll come to in a minute. I think, as Franz Theos did, there's limited evidence of the church in these emporia. The cemeteries at Hamwich, for example, are tiny and perplexingly small. What's noticeable is that transport amphorae are rare, and so the wine for silver argument is intriguing in itself. And what's now much more noticeable than it was when I was working on this is that the well-dated, well-studied red-painted wares of northwest France that have been put together by people like Etienne Louis are extraordinarily rare in real terms from, say, Hamwich. In other words, there seems to be a change and perhaps greater control exercised in terms of regional roles after 790. And I still, as I did in Dark Age economics, would argue, for reasons you'll see again in a moment, that 820, 830 is a moment of significant change in these places, as Franz Theos long ago pointed out, as regional trade through controlled devolution, regionalization, as Loveluck and Tys pointed out, takes precedence at what Franz Theos calls transactional sites, in other words, places with cult importance. Now, what is, coming back to the main theme, and I've still a good deal of time to pursue it, the Anglo-Saxon missions seem to have headed whatever with their silver onto the continent. And in particular, if you look at the continental archaeology, it's not very rich, but it's not so different from the late Roman archaeology in the southern part of Gaul. In northern Gaul, places like Hamage, small monasteries, Ectonac, small monasteries and earlier Roman villas are incredibly impoverished and not at all like what Gabor Thomas has found in Lyminge. What you're seeing, one suspects, is not just the Anglo-Saxon missions colonizing parts of the continent, but actually offering new ideas to people like Chrodegang of Metz in the third quarter of the 8th century. And that coincides in the third quarter of the 8th century with, I think, one of the most extraordinarily important aspects of Latin Christian archaeology in this period, the creation of the first and second phases of the Carolingian palatial society. Rather like Minoan palaces, these are places of conspicuous consumption with antique symbolism, and they're sucking up not just the intelligentsia like Alcuin from England, but also, as John Mitchell has pointed out, a lot of Lombard ideas in terms of art and decoration, and in terms of material culture, particularly marbles and the like, to create places like Aachen through its various phases, Ingelheim, Nijmegen, and so on. That's led me to see two phases of these Carolingian monasteries based within the world of the Carolingian palaces, and conceivably two phases of Carolingian palaces, but I think we know too little about that, and that's a long shot I can't really comment on. The first one, where you move to a monastery with a church, a proprietary church with a palace and a cloister and an abbot's palace, which has some productive elements and is beginning to promote the theocratic views of the Carolingian world. The second one is the sacred production that I will come to in a minute, where there's craft production that's controlled in the monastic workshops as well as guest houses. The first one, that is the earliest example of the Carolingian Renaissance monasteries is perhaps Mouster, that we have available with modern dated archaeology in Switzerland, 787 the dendro dates, which show a very tight organization. And that precedes almost certainly the creation of the second type of monastic outreach that comes through the general changes, the reforms, the correctio that Peter Brown has laid before us as one of the key axiomatic points of Europe in the later 8th century, in which, in effect, a series of legislation is laid before the main palatial communities, and then gradually, over the following two generations, diffused to all parts of the Carolingian world. That diffusion, which affected, on the one hand, the elite in terms of management of personnel and in terms of managing agrarian activity, also is embodied in the Plan of St. Gall, as I mentioned a moment ago very briefly, as a consequence of the determination to reach out beyond the closed monastic world of the 750-790 era. St. Gall, almost certainly a schematic monastery out of that arises out of the discussions of the Synod of Aachen happening in 816, was an attempt to try and promote that legislation and to around these so-called sacred fortresses in all parts of the Carolingian world. And for a short time, it undoubtedly worked. And so what I've tried to do is to look at this in terms of, as some of you may know, my excavations at San Vincenzo al Volturno, and then relate that, for example, to other monastic establishments and other archaeological circumstances elsewhere in Italy, and then refer it back, as you'll see in a moment, to Northwest Europe. Very simply, the earliest monastery in the 8th century, like that monastery at Hamage, like the ones we saw at the end of antiquity in Albania at Butrint, were a Roman villa to all intents and purposes, a villa rustica, that was essentially materially poor, materially primitive. That was wholly transformed, and the excavations show this rather clearly now, when the old monastery at the top was turned into a palace, and a palace almost certainly for Grimoald, who had been a hostage in Aachen, a palace with its own corridor down to a massive new church with an atrium, while a new cloister range actually positioned around an abbot's palace that you can see reconstructed in this. A new cloister range provided a second thoroughfare, the so-called upper thoroughfare you can see on this drawing. This was a planned monastery using a Beneventan pace, much like the planned circumstances that Blair has illustrated in England. And I think this planning is far more inherent to many of these archaeological sites than we've seen before. This process is transformed in the second quarter of the 9th century, when a crypt is inserted in the main church, San Vincenzo Maggiore, when a third access route is created through the atrium, leading to through a porter's lodge, leading through the atrium up into the church, to that cult site in the crypt, and on the south side, amazingly, a line of workshops, the so-called collective workshop, is constructed. And in that collective workshop, certainly by the before the earthquake of 848, there is a chamberlain's presence, just like there was, certainly an officer's presence with his own apartment, just like there was a presence in the St. Gall Plan collective workshop, where the goods that are made here, such as these various trefoils, and other objects I'll come to in a moment were distributed as counter gifts to those who donated the vast number of estates in central southern Italy that San Vincenzo acquired in this period. At the same time as doing this, exactly the same time, the monastery begins to then invest in its own territory, in its own circumstances, and is, in a sense, building up an agrarian power base around itself that ultimately, in the high to late Middle Ages, it came to depend on, but at this period was merely a supplement to what it gained from its widely diffused estates. The new agent in all this, as in the St. Gall plan, is the so-called chamberlain, the officer, who in this particular case had a two-roomed apartment that had a little fireplace in one and a corridor, and most importantly, access up a staircase of his own up to the atrium, so a fourth entrance way to the monastery's cult site. And from here, there's trefoils, enamels, and perhaps most significantly, the bindings for books that we assume were being made in the scriptorium of the monastery and given, I've postulated, as counter gifts to those who donated from all over central southern Italy to the monastery, and then significantly were buried over the hillside adjacent to the crypt at the west end of San Vincenzo Maggiore. Now, it's a long way from San Vincenzo to the Carolingian world, but what I've tried to illustrate is the growing importance of managing craft production within a monastic context, and then using it strategically, much as Peter Brown imagined it might be used, to the advantage of a well-managed monastic situation. Concurrent with that, you find some changes in dining culture here, and I'm showing you the fine stemmed glasses on the one hand that are found in the monastery, and I'm showing you some from our recent excavations, but in only small quantities, recent excavations of a royal site, which I'll come to in a moment, but only in small amounts. The idea that this monastery was sucking in huge amounts of long-distance trade, for example, simply doesn't hold anything. There's no evidence of that. There are two imported Abbasid bowls smashed in 881. There's a nephrite jade pommel. There's actually an escutcheon from a hanging bowl, and a few other wonderful objects, almost certainly from the monastery's treasury. But transport amphorae from further afield, none. Evidence of long-distance traded pottery, none. All made locally and contained within this very closed world. It's a changing economic axis that posed, as we know from the story of San Vincenzo and many of these other monasteries, such as Farfar and Monte Cassino, an obvious threat to a growing aristocratic world, and that aristocracy in San Vincenzo's case led in 881 to the destruction and sack of the monastery, with its reforming some 100 and something years later in an entirely different iteration. So what I'm trying to suggest is, piece by piece, we're seeing monasteries moving from centers of consumption to being centers of consumption as proprietary monasteries, to centers of production and things with control of counter gifts in this particular world playing a key part. But this world, of course, as you all well know, is not entirely defined by monasteries. The huge estates that we can now see excavation fragments of, thanks to a lot of the the French instap excavations across France, the huge 9th century estates that are blossoming in this period give us a hint that parallel to the monastic communities that we're seeing on the continent, within the Carolingian world, there are the creation of industrial villages. I've put a few here, the Vorgeberger Hills that produce Baarderwares, the Houilly potteries, and I've particularly been taken by a recent publication of Saron in the Loire, near Orléans. There's the quernstone industries, the soapstone industries we now know on the Swiss-Italian border at Puro. There must have been similar glass-making villages, and as I'll show you in a moment, we are beginning to understand iron production at the royal site we've been dealing with at Vetricella. Saron is fascinating because it would appear just south of Orléans, the massive excavations carried out in salvage terms have produced a great number of different forms of kilns, producing a massive standardized 9th century pottery. The site of Vetricella, that we've been working on for some years, thanks to the European community. I've given you a beautiful view of it in the later 9th, early 10th century, done by one of the excavators, Francesco Sala. And here you can see the Martian circles that are what we actually found on the ground. What we think it to be is not a Motte and Bailey castle, but almost certainly a small, I often call it the bankomat, a small timber tower surrounded by three circles, three ditches, and around it initially, across the fields in the countryside around, traces of ironworking that in the 10th century and into the early 11th century is expanded into the site itself as the ditches, rather like that famous ditch at Hamwich, are filled in and very deliberately filled in. And what one sees here from the later 9th through to the early 11th century are forged commodities, particularly horse gear and house gear. So locks and keys. On the one hand, you can see a key left in that post hole that's demolished roughly in 1025. You can see the horseshoes that occur in great numbers, and Lorenzo Marasco, the excavator, is holding one of the dozens of spurs that have come from the site. What one sees in tandem with that, thanks to the work of our various teams, is a massive number of areas that have been subjected to kilns, presumably working smelted iron from the offshore island of Elba on the one hand, and on the other, the transformation, in this case rather late by Carolingian standards, and here we're almost certainly in the later 9th, 10th centuries, the transformation of the river valley and the adoption of the olive and chestnut amongst other trees and fruit trees at this time, as the landscape is transformed, with villages in the immediate environs and the hills behind now having silos for grain, seed corn on the one hand, and evidence, albeit at this late date, of secondary products being produced, unlike the earlier 9th century and 8th century as peasant sites that have been excavated in the area. What we can see from this Italian context is, in effect, a later version of what you can see, for example, in northern France or southern France or parts of the Low Countries, namely that peasants have material culture, in the Italian case, in a very small amount in the 9th century, that is suddenly massively ramped up in the 10th and 11th centuries, alongside the acquisition of silos, in one manorial case, Monterenti, of a granary, and a general transformation of the agricultural management. In other words, there is, in the 850 period onwards, if not slightly before, while the monasteries are practicing a gift exchange process that is hinging around the production of counter gifts for the Christian sold so that it might slip into place, on the one hand. On the other, when seeing aristocratic estates, royal estates, aristocratic estates, and conceivably monastic estates producing material culture that in its own way is persuading the peasantry that change has come about. I see, therefore, the 9th century as a very interesting period, and for the most part, in which the Vikings and the Arabs, who've been the great perpetrators, and Netflix still concede them to be so, of the history of the period, is completely ephemeral, except for what they bring to the party, which is an engaged, I suppose, extra community view of things. In other words, what you see in the 9th century is the development of a commodity production, secondary agricultural products, that is in part and parcel thanks to a third order that has been discreetly brought about through the monasteries, through that world that Peter Brown described as a binary opposition between a laity and a clergy. In other words, there is now a material authority to this world that is distinctly significant in how it proceeds. And that, therefore, brings me to a concluding and quite I think, a substantive, but as yet unclear concluding series of points. I think, first and foremost, I see the great divergence, which I don't think many people any longer, even Chris Wickham, any longer challenge. Rome, the greatest of all these cities, is clearly now very primitive in the 8th, and not that much less primitive in the 9th centuries. It's a post-fiscal Europe, and it's a Europe in which gift-giving for salvation is part and parcel from the 7th century onwards, out of this political economy. The role of the church in creating a third order, I've tried to intimate, is a significant adaptive point in the Carolingian Renaissance. Did it start, did they acquire it from the Anglo-Saxons or even the Celtic church? Well, it's obviously difficult to establish yes or no, but there's little doubt that the Anglo-Saxon ministers like Clonfada, Nendrum in Ireland were producing in a manner that was completely alien to the later Merovingian monasteries. And so how they came to do this, how they came to have this productive third order, I find deeply intriguing and will value any ideas on where that came about. The industrial villages would appear to be paralleling the what is to all extent and purposes Pam Crabtree's secondary products revolution, which is an emphasis upon management of land that begins certainly in the Rhine, Seine, Thames triangle, and then is diffused by stages until it reaches those nether parts of Tuscany that I was describing a moment ago. But the industrialization in itself is a fascinating phenomenon. How it took place and why it took place, it seems to me a key and important aspect of all of this. And then there's the role of Anglo-Saxon England as opposed to Latin Christendom and the Carolingian world is deeply tempting. And of course, with this vaccine issue and people looking at Brexit again, it's very tempting to see Anglo-Saxon England as very different. But long ago, I argued that Anglo-Saxon England by 800 had, in a sense, a much more defined royal family that paid only lip service, judging from their refusal to really sustain any kind of Carolingian theocracy. It was paying lip service to the church rather than actually promoting it to the same extent that, for example, Charlemagne and his successors did. There seems to be a bifurcation there that's quite intriguing, that probably has its roots in earlier circumstances. If it has its roots in earlier circumstances, it may well shed more light on the role of, for example, of the emporia as opposed to these productive minsters. And it may shed more light on the shift from an emphasis on prestige goods being imported through the emporia to a steady regionalization that leads to the emporia effectively being abandoned in the second quarter of the 9th century, certainly in the middle of the 9th century, and being succeeded by a whole host of other smaller places that by the end of the 9th century are being turned into control points, the burhs, where industrialization happens fairly quickly and remarkably. And all of that, let's remind ourselves, in the English case, since I'm talking to you in England, happens as the West, as this tribal hidage patchwork quilt of territories is reduced to, in effect, two by the end of the 8th century, Wessex versus Mercia, with Northumbria on the fringe, and then gradually Wessex consumes much of Mercia, and the Danelaw consumes the other part of Mercia and Northumbria. An argument I put forward some 30 years ago, which English historians hated the idea of, but it does suggest a changing royal control, which I know at the time was very unpopular with my critics. Certainly, it's apparent that the role of towns, as opposed to industrial villages, is very minor on the continent. Franz Theus in the Low Countries, on the one hand, and most of the Italian archaeologists I know on the other, are pushing the creation of urbanization, places like Venice or Pisa, back after the year 1000, as the world is now once more past this great divergence. In other words, the industrial villages play a significant role, while the old legacy towns are still the homes, for the most part, of the aristocracy. And that brings one to the last point, which I think is the most important, is how did consensus and persuasion or whatever happen to drive this? That's the underlying role. We've seen it through a series of iterations in which, on the one hand, there's been class struggles, on the other, there's been very much a top-down view in terms of the monarchy through the textual evidence. It is very tempting to see this more in terms of an economy that is driven as much as anything by the bottom up as the top down. The archaeology of the countryside in all these areas is one that has yet to give us this sense of diversity that perhaps the texts lead us to suppose. And in this, if that's so, and this is very much the argument that Franz Theus has had for 20 years, in these circumstances, those who might be at the top, the aristocracy, have to find a way to persuade the others to create the kind of new relationships that they do based upon land management. And to do that, on the one hand, as I've suggested, the gifts for salvation matter to one level of society, but I suspect our archaeological evidence of craft materialism and improved diet matters in the other respect. it's perhaps no coincidence that the first charters for villages in Italy happen 2 generations after you see the emergence of materialism in rural life in these villages, and in particular improved diet through management of their livestock and their grain economies, cereal economies. So I'm coming increasingly to see a political economy that is much more nuanced and certainly not as uniform as it might once have appeared, with some obvious lacunae that are fascinating to contemplate, and in many cases cul-de-sacs in terms of research, because we know too little still about, for example, the Carolingian palaces. But we have at our fingertips, I think, a way of going back to engage with, for example, Peter Brown's paradigm, engage with Ian Wood's Temple Society, Maaike de Jong's view of this kind of polity, and ask ourselves fresh questions of an archaeology that, by any standards, is now quite rich and remarkable. And with the increased availability of dating materials, it's possible to work within these paradigms much more effectively than it was, for example, 40 years ago when I wrote Dark Age Economics. Brandon, I think that's enough of this fairy story, or what David Hinton, when I was writing my thesis, since I saw him on the line, called faction. But anyway, any thoughts you have are we're greatly appreciative.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Richard. As always, that was a very broad and all-encompassing talk, and you synthesized a lot of data there very well. So I'm sure our audience enjoyed it very much. I'm going to now open this whole talk up to questions. So I'm going to ask you please to either type your question into the chat or use the raise hand feature as so. So I know that you're ready to ask the question.
I should reiterate, I can't see any of you, and I'm just keeping my...
Yeah, I will... I'm waiting for questions, and while I'll let our audience kind of collect their thoughts, and we can start maybe a discussion with this, Richard. As you had mentioned this gift-giving economy, and I think you touched on it a little bit, but what role do you think, if any, the kind of land grants played into that? Is that part of the sort of gifting to save souls as well as the exchange of material?
I think land grants are part and parcel of the whole process, and I didn't touch on that because it's impossible. I only touched ephemerally on it because it's impossible for us as archaeologists to really demonstrate that. On the other hand, I can show you very clearly in the case of San Vincenzo, which is why I work so hard to analyze the stratigraphy and the topography of that site. I can show you in terms of Chris Wickham, who worked with me on this, I can show you that as the cult of St. Vincent was acquired almost certainly by Beneventan monks, you can see there's a pattern of acquisition of land, substantial acquisition of land that follows that acquisition. In other words, the gifts go with the acquisition of land. The acquisition of land, however, makes this a highly contentious operation because the land is dispersed in so many different places and very difficult to manage.
Yeah, thank you for that. I now have a question from Ian. So Ian, you may unmute yourself.
Hello there. Can you hear me okay, Richard?
I can, in Cornwall, no less.
Good.
I left out Cornwall and I left out St. Patrick, and I felt guilty.
It's okay. I can live with that. No, I mean I thoroughly enjoyed it all, really. and I have a couple of questions to follow on. First of all, you noted that there are so few burials really from Hamwick, and indeed not so very many from Ipswich as well.
Yeah.
On the one hand, it is true that more and more are now coming out, and that almost every other site that, say, Matt or Phil dig in Hamwick produces a burial or two. But you're still absolutely right. So I just wonder, where do you think these burials are? Are they the other side of that ditch? Are they to the north of Hamwick? Are they at Bittern, where in fact there are burials at Bittern? Was Bittern the cemetery for Hamwick?
I honestly don't know, Ian. It's a good point. It could be Bittern. It's the same point for Dorestadt, which is even bigger, as Franz Taylor pointed out. And he pointed it out, if you recall, in his argument that these places lay beyond this world of transactions. They were separate, and they eventually became anachronistic because they were separated. In other words, because there was no church, because there's no burial, he felt that Dorestadt declined and was succeeded by a tier of other such places. Now, having said that, I do wonder in the case of Ipswich, rather Hamwich, London, Ipswich, York, Yorkwick, are we seeing some kind of mediated relationship with the church because clearly the local power wanted to control that transactional operation? Are we seeing some relationship with the church where burial does occur close by but outside? Honestly, I don't know, but it is very striking. And of course, there is an argument that St Mary's in Hamwich may well have been there all along. I think it was. Someone made that point quite recently. But honestly, it's Franz's argument is pretty seductive, not least if he is right about the reverse economy between the minsters and the continent. In other words, that there were a lot of minsters vying for your salvation in the immediate environs of Hamwich, for example.
Yeah. Just very quickly as well, I mean, a different part of it really, but your Vetricella material, you made a very good point about, particularly about the horse fittings that you're finding. You seem to have quite a lot of those as well. What sort of date were you putting on those?
We have 2,500 iron objects, and they date from the carbon. We have about 60 radiocarbon dates, and they date from basically the second half of the 9th century, but only a small proportion, through to the beginnings of the 11th century, with the richest number coming from the filling of the ditches, which occur probably in the middle of the 10th century, with Attonian coins added in with them to give us additional chronological fixes. In other words, those prick spurs you could see are probably late 9th, 10th century.
Right. And do you think
I can send you the article? Alex, who's worked on it, has done fantastic study of all of them now.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. And I also have a question typed question from Neil Christie, also about Vetricella. He says, can Richard tell us what the market was for those multiple iron products, local or further flung towns or new elites, but not the church? And with such high production, what numbers of workers, full-time presumably, were based there?
Two questions then. Okay, Neil. The answer is we can't be sure. I my Italian colleagues want the materials to be, the process to be as follows. The smelting to be on Elva, the landing of the raw iron there, the making of the objects in forges there, and we have forges as well, I should add, and then for those objects to be distributed to principally Lucca, in other words, the primary royal establishment in the Tuscan region, in the Tuscan March. I'm less than persuaded, but I'll probably get my head cut off for saying this locally, because what you see in the villages, and quite a few have been excavated in the immediate vicinity, is from radiocarbon dated sites. You see significant agrarian changes and household changes from the early to mid 10th century, probably beginning in the later 9th, but certainly radiocarbon dated to the 10th centuries. And I myself wonder if some of this, if not all of it, is providing these places with material culture. Now, at the same time, how many people were there? We simply don't know. I think we made the classic misunderstanding at the beginning. We assumed, and I should circle back to this, we assumed in 2015 that this was a motte-like settlement. By 2017, we realized that the motte-like settlement was a tiny pinprick, probably the bankomat, as I call it, a little tower in the middle, and where they ate well and drank well and had lovely pottery. And out in the fields for kilometers around, we have evidence of ironworking. So were there 10, 20, 50? I don't know. The graveyard, which we've excavated part of it, is the most bizarre graveyard. It has a lot of infants. So it has about 50 individuals in the area we've excavated, half of whom are infants, and then a group of very undernourished women at some distance, and then a group of large so-called tall men, I suspect they're not that tall men close to the infants. So I'm not convinced that it was permanent all the time. I would myself favor, knowing the place, that they would use the weather cycles skillfully, as potters did, to have seasons where they worked a lot of this. But that's another debate to be had.
I think I can accept one more question. I see Jose has his hand raised, so you can send us your question, Jose, please.
Thank you very much. Just a quick one. I mean, the question is quick. I don't know if the answer will be quick. Why is this happening precisely in Western Europe? I mean, for what you are describing, the ingredients for this are also in the Byzantine War and in the Islamic War, and things go completely different there. I mean, in the Islamic War, we have these big towns already in the 9th century in North Africa, of course in the Middle East and in Spain. Why would you say that things go so differently in Western Europe?
It's a very good question, Jose. As you know fully well from having worked in the Islamic world, the differences between something massive, the tons of glass produced entire in the 9th century, on the one hand, dwarfs anything produced in the entire Europe, Latin Christendom. So the differences are stupendous. Why the difference? Essentially, Peter Brown would argue that its Latin Christendom has devised its own internally reinforced political economy that won't share its ideas beyond its boundaries. Now, why it didn't share, having said that, I think you can see very little Arab intervention, to be honest. I know our friend Johnny Mitchell tries to find it all the time in the iconography, but very little, the artistic iconography, but very little evidence of Arab ideas. I suspect there is some evidence of Byzantine ideas, but Byzantium itself, until I think roughly around 1000, was a hugely reduced agrarian regime, living in the most part from the work we've done in the Balkans in very primitive circumstances by comparison with the world that we know of from early Byzantium, the 5th, 6th centuries. In other words, what we see in Latin Christendom is a version of that happens there. What doesn't happen there is the loss of a lot of knowledge. And I suspect some of the knowledge that, for example, the glassmaking knowledge that one finds in Southern Europe translated through to the Carolingian world is coming out of Byzantium, but in a very filtered way, is not really the engagement of Byzantium, for example, with Italy, is not at all apparent, and judging from the archaeology of Byzantine Italy, until the end of the 10th, early 11th centuries. So if you, coming back to the beginning, is a political economy that's defined very much around Peter Brown, if I may put it that way, Peter Brown's views of the church. I'm not sure that's answered your question, but it actually, that's what the archaeology shows, and I think we've got to find ways to explain that more effectively.
That's fascinating, thank you.
Okay, so I don't see any lingering questions, and anyway, we're after 6 o'clock here in Leicester. So I'll close up now. We've had a pretty great tour of basically the economy of the early Middle Ages, going from our Celtic and Anglo-Saxon monasteries.
On St. Patrick's Day, and I forgot to mention that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Happy St. Patrick's Day to you all. Yeah, I guess in that case, it's a highly relevant topic. So you've chosen a good day for it, Richard. So thank you. Yeah. So thank you, Richard, for coming to us live and for sorting out the weird time change and everything, and for giving up your lunch for this. We appreciate it. We hope that you can make a visit to Leicester in person sometime in the near future. But yeah, thank you also to the audience for coming. This is when we'd all give you a round of applause. I release you all to go enjoy your dinners. Good night.
Bye-bye.